I won't take much time to introduce Professor Marrouchi beyond saying that he comes to us from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, the Department of English, where he holds a senior professorial post. His training is in English literature and comparative literature, post-colonial literature, new historicism, drama, terrorism, Islamism, third world literature. There are few things he doesn't dabble in or engage. I want to bring to your attention it's a book that's listed. It says 2011. I'm not sure if it's out or available.
Came out, yeah.
The Fabric of Subcultures, Networks, Ethnic Force Fields, and Peoples Without Power. Sounds fascinating, so
Thank you.
Should all get that. I first learned about Mustapha's work through this wonderfully named book, Signifying with a Vengeance, and I have continued to learn much from him about that problematic and dynamic. So we're just really, really pleased and honored to have you with us today. I have as topic Q&A Journey Through a Seismic Arab World. Again, welcome to ISS, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Winbush. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I think I should begin by perhaps giving you a room with a view to my background. My beginnings rather than origin. I mean, origins tend to be rather sacred and beginnings tend to be secular. So I'm a Berber Sufi. I was born and raised in Sufi Islam, although today I hold a secular view of the world. I don't know whether you met any Berbers in your life, but if you haven't, well, I'm here in the flesh. It's, yes. Berbers, Berber language is like the hieroglyphics in Egypt. Berber language is not a Semite language. It's an African language. It's very close to Wolof in Senegal, actually. And Sufism in Berber quarters, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, is celebrated in an odd way because one has to drink quite a bit of wine, and then once he or she is rather light-hearted, then they engage in a meditation, on the Quran. If one has to look back, Ibn al-Arabi, for example, 11th century, Ibn Rushd, Al-Hallaj, Ibn Khaldun, Masadi, today Hisham Jayed, Abdul Khatibi, Tahir bin Jalloun. You have quite an array of scholars who engage in that activity, oddly enough, that can be criticized or degraded or desanitized by the rest of the Islamic world. The Berbers were defeated the third time, or they were invaded by the Arabs in the late 7th century. They were ruled at the time by a woman, a Jewish priestess called the Queen Al-Kahina, who did not surrender. And I'm not trying to delve into some sort of nativism. I'm not privileging, one narrative in relation to other. I'm not saying Berbers are better than the Arabs. That's not my intention, or anyone else, Jews or Christians and so on. But just to tell you about the Berber race has been around for quite a while, and nowadays, scientifically speaking, we're finding out that the DNA of Berber people is exactly the same as the Irish. So it's quite a discovery. So that's really schooled. I was schooled in a Jesuit school in the south of France, because at the time, Tunisia and Algeria were colonies of France, and then from there to the United Kingdom and Canada and the U.S. It's a terrible identity. Okay. I have prepared a little synopsis here, which will help us, steer the way to a discussion. I journeyed through the Arab world. I was invited to teach in France last spring, and that was very, very good for me because I managed to travel through the Arab world from Morocco to Egypt during the revolution. Okay, and it opened my eyes, to a lot of things. Okay, so I will just go ahead and present this, and then we can engage in a conversation. Okay. According to Hegel, repetition plays a crucial role in history. When something happens just once, it may be dismissed as an accident, something that might have been avoided if the situation had been handled differently. But when the same event repeats itself, it is a sign that a deeper historical process is unfolding. When Napoleon lost at Leipzig in 1813, it looked like bad luck. When he lost again in Waterloo, it was clear that his time was over. The same holds for the so-called Arab Spring. In January 2011, when Tunisia was burning, it was presented as an uprising that could be halted or limited to that tiny country. Now that signs of a repeated revolution are gathering steam to topple other dictators in the Arab world, it is clear that we are facing a tour de force in history like we never had before. It is a structural phenomenon in what Michel Foucault called the microphysics of power. Although the uprising in Tunisia was triggered by the self-immolation of a young man, everyone agrees that it expresses a deeper unease, but of what kind? As with other uprisings in the region, the people who rose against tyranny had no message to deliver except the obvious one: to live in dignity. This is why it is difficult to conceive of the event in Marxist terms as an instance of the emergence of the revolutionary subject. It fits much better the Hegelian notion of the rabble, those outside organized social space who can express their discontent only through irrational outbursts of destructive violence, what Hegel called abstract negativity. There is an old story about a worker suspected of stealing. Every evening, as he leaves the factory, the wheelbarrow he pushes in front of him is carefully inspected. The guards find nothing. It is always empty. Finally, the penny drops. What the worker is thieving are the wheelbarrows themselves. The guards were missing the obvious truth, just as the commentators on the Arab Spring have done. We are told that the disintegration of the dictatorial regimes signaled the end of ideology. The time of large-scale ideological projects culminating in sheer oppression was over. We had entered a new era of rational, pragmatic politics. If the commonplace that we live in, post-ideological era, is true in any sense, it can be seen in this recent outburst of mass outrage. This is +1 degree protest as opposed to 0 degree protest, a pertinent action demanding everything, not a violent action demanding nothing. This is the social space that Alain Badiou speaks about in Being an Event, where he maintains that it is increasingly experienced as wordless. In such a space, the only form protest can take is meaningless violence. Perhaps this is one of the main dangers of capitalism. Although by virtue of being global, it encompasses the whole world, it sustains a wordless ideological constellation in which people are deprived of their ways of locating meaning. The fundamental lesson of globalization is that capitalism can accommodate itself to all civilizations, from Christian to Hindu to Buddhist to Muslim, from west to east, north to south. There is no global capitalist worldview, no capitalist civilization proper. The global dimension of capitalism represents truth without meaning. The first conclusion to be drawn from the Arab Spring, therefore, is that it was the multitude, though underprivileged and de facto socially deprived and indeed excluded, that rose against tyranny. Representation, dignity, pride, hope formed their motto and indeed reason for being. The fact that they had no program is therefore itself a reality to be interpreted. It tells us a great deal about our ideological post-predicament and the kind of society we inhabit, a society that has been led to believe that it can celebrate choice, but in which the only available alternative to poverty and exclusion is a blind acting out. It is in this sense that opposition to systematic dictatorship can articulate itself only through a rupture, a spontaneous outburst. Otherwise, what is the point of our celebrated quasi-freedom of choice when the only choice we have is between playing by the rule of oppression, nepotism, and injustice on the one hand, and self-destructive violence and mass outrage on the other? One challenge facing those of us who take the Arab Spring seriously is to read it not as a repetition of the past, but as an original experiment that has opened new political possibilities relevant well beyond the region for freedom and democracy. Indeed, our hope is that through this cycle of struggle, the Arab world becomes for the next decade what Latin America was for the last, that is, a laboratory of political experimentation between powerful social movements and progressive governments from Argentina to Venezuela, from Brazil to Bolivia. The revolt has immediately performed a kind of ideological house cleaning, sweeping away racist conceptions of a clash of civilizations that consigned Arab politics to the past. The multitudes in Tunis, Cairo, Damascus, Sana'a, Manama, and Tripoli shatter the political stereotypes that Arabs are constrained to the choice between secular dictatorships and fanatical theocracies, or that Muslims are somehow incapable of freedom and democracy. This is the thesis expounded upon by Mr. Bernard Lewis and later on by the late Samuel Huntington, but there are many others. We can discuss this a little later. Even calling these struggles revolutions seems to mislead commentators who assume that the progression of events must obey the logic of 1789 or 1917 or some other past European rebellion against kings and czars. The Arab Spring inspired around the issue of unemployment, and at its center have been highly educated youth with frustrated ambitions, a population that has much in common with protesting students in London and Rome. Although the primary demand throughout the Arab world focuses on the end of tyranny and authoritarian governments, behind this single cry stands a series of social demands about work and life, not only to end dependency and poverty, but to give power and autonomy to an intelligent, highly capable population. That Zain al-Abidin bin Ali and Hosni Mubarak and Muammar Gaddafi leave power is only the first step. The organization of the Arab Springs resembles what we have seen for more than a decade in other parts of the world, from Seattle to Buenos Aires, from Genoa to Cochabamba, Bolivia. A horizontal network that has no single central leader. Traditional opposition bodies can participate in this network but cannot direct it. Outside observers have tried to designate a leader for the Egyptian revolt since its inception. Maybe it is Mohammed al-Baradei, maybe Google's head of marketing, Wael Ghanim. They fear that the Muslim Brotherhood or some other body will take control of events. What they do not understand is that the multitude is able to organize itself without a center, that the imposition of a leader or being co-opted by traditional organization would undermine its power. The prevalence in the Arab Spring of social network tools such as Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter are symptoms, not causes, of this organizational structure. These are the modes of expression of an intelligent population capable of using the instruments at hand to organize autonomously. Although these organized network movements refuse central leadership, they must nonetheless consolidate their demands in a new constituent process that links the most active segments of the rebellion to the needs of the population at large. The insurrection of Arab youth are certainly not aimed at traditional liberal constitution that merely guarantees the division of powers and a regular electoral dynamic, but rather at a form of democracy adequate to the new forms of expression and needs of the multitude. This must include, firstly, the constitutional recognition of the freedom of expression, not in the form typical of the dominant media, which is constantly subject to the corruption of governments and economic elites, but one that is represented by the common experiences of network relations. And given that these uprisings were sparked by not only widespread unemployment and destitute poverty, but also by a generalized sense of frustrated, productive, and expressive capacities, especially among young people, a radical constitutional response must invent a common plan to manage natural resources and social production. That is a threshold through which no neoliberalism cannot pass, and capitalism is put to question, and Islamic rule is completely inadequate to meet these needs. Here, insurrection touches not only in the equilibriums of the Maghreb and the Middle East, but also the global system of economic governance. Hence our hope for the cycle of struggles spreading in the Arab world to become like Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, to inspire political movements and raise aspirations for freedom and democracy beyond the region. Each revolt, of course, may fail. Tyrants may unleash bloody repression, as witnessed the bloodbath in Syria and Libya. Military juntas may try to remain in power. Traditional opposition groups may attempt to hijack movements, and religious hierarchies may jockey to take control. But what will not die are the political demands and desires that have been unleashed, the expressions of an intelligent and highly educated young generation for a different way of life in which they can put their capacities to use. As long as those demands and desires live, the cycle of struggles will continue. The question is what these new experiments in freedom and democracy will teach the world over the next decade. Today, as an outcome of the Arab Spring, there exists a commonality of work characterized by the immateriality, cognitive contents, networking, and communication implicit in all areas of labor and capitalism. This take requires a radical shift in how we conceive the organization of social change. Revolution is no longer a matter of capturing the Winter Palace, Tony Negri reminds us. Indeed, I'm still quoting, what we have is these forms of interaction, this capacity of networks, this plurality, this pluralism, this contextuality, which is becoming more and more broadly extended, end of quote. Granted, but how can the anger, urgency, and aggressiveness that we have seen across the Arab world and in Spain, England, Portugal, and Greece be organized? In Commonwealth, Negri addresses this question. He calls the anger indignation and traces it back to Spinoza, who notes that in indignation we discover our power to act against oppression. But the problem is how to transform these moments of popular anger into durable institutions of people's power. For Negri and his comrades, in this late phase of capitalism, the whole metropolis becomes the arena of production and resistance. We are ruled under a system that is bipolitical, that's his phrase, with the whole life as politics. Revolutionary theory has to be developed in the biopolitical context, he thinks, taking Karl Marx and immersing him in Michel Foucault. So what is the job of real revolutionaries? Our task, he answers, is to investigate the organizational framework of antagonistic subjectivities that arise from below, based on the indignation expressed by subjects in the face of unfreedoms, exploitation, and expropriation, end of quote. Indignation would seem a flaky concept, yet as I write this, the live video stream from Sirte Square, Libya, is showing thousands of freedom fighters besieging the stronghold of Gaddafi and his followers over the liberation of the region. On a big banner, one can see the word that symbolizes this quest for freedom, the indignant ones. Like the Tunisian indignados before them, they come into their being. And in doing so, they become the true agents of the revolution. In their march, in a direct, purposeful manner, they dismiss the entire political class, right and left, Islamic and non-Islamic, as corrupt and controlled by a lust for power, yet their manifesto, nevertheless, consists of a series of demands addressed to the whole world. Not the people themselves. The indignados do not yet claim that no one else will face the storm for them, that they themselves have to be the change they want to see. And this is their most vital and perhaps fatal weakness. They express an authentic rage which is not able to transform itself into a positive program of socio-political change. In fact, they express a spirit of revolt without revolution. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I know that Professor Marrouchi wanted to give us as much time as possible to interact with one another. And so he's put on the table something very provocative, perspectives for us to react to. So the floor is open up for exchange, and to go in any direction you like. So responses, questions, here's the opportunity.
Let me just say this, if I may, Dr. Wimish, at the outset. What I witnessed in the Arab world, traveling through the Arab world, is quite extraordinary. But the reaction to these revolutions changes from one country to another, and even within the same country. I visited Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. In Morocco, you have a lot of anger and a lot of poverty, but it is not directed at the king, the ruling family, who happens to be a Alawi. They've been there for almost 500 years now. The king is almost sacred. Once you mention the king, let's say you take a cab, and then you say to the cab driver, what do you think of the king? You know, the person looks at you in the mirror, you know, and they blush, and the body language changes completely. And they say, oh, no, the king is fantastic. What we are really bent on changing is the government itself. So there is a subservient view of the society itself. And you find this at all echelons. I mean, I gave a lecture at the University of Mohammed Khamis, you know, in Fez, and you're talking to university professors, and they cringe when you mention the king. You move on to Algeria, a different history altogether, mainly because of occupation. The French stayed there for almost 135 years. The Algerians lost about 1 million people to liberate themselves from French domination. And the Algerian, has a tendency to be, quote unquote, upfront, aggressive. I mean, they'll tell it as it is. And if you're not pleased, tough, okay? And you could see, because during the Civil War, they lost about 500,000 people, even though some people would resist the connotation Civil War. They'd say, well, it wasn't really a Civil War because we didn't know who was doing what, either the Islamists or the army, okay? And maybe even both of them were doing the killing. They were not really that keen on going all the way to a revolution because they had a taste of violence, okay? I mean, terrible violence. You go to Tunisia, which is, in my view, is the most educated country in the Arab world. First of all, it's a small country. It has been secular all along. Tunisia abolished polygamy in 1956. Okay, what is called la parité in French. You have to have 50% women, 50% men in the assembly. They had that, okay? I think it is the only country, they're about to have an election on October 23rd. It's the only country that can pull it through. And if Tunisia can, I think eventually the rest of the Arab world will follow. And all of a sudden, the 23 years of Ben Ali, who was a debauched general, and with his family and in-laws, I mean, they really ran the country like some sort of a company, okay? By the time they left, they took about $14 billion and 18 kilos of gold, massive, okay? But all of a sudden, that 23 years was wiped out. They went back to the Bourguiba eras. Hira was a humanist, educated in Paris, and he was a kind of secular person, okay? There is Islam as a background, but we need to do some work, okay? We can't just blaming it on fatalism and Allah and all the rest of it. Libya is a different country altogether. I mean, you have tribes. I mean, Gaddafi did something quite interesting since '69. He kept, it's a chessboard, okay? He kept privileging one tribe in relation to another. That's how he ruled, I mean, for almost 40 years, okay? That's a different country altogether. The country doesn't have a constitution at all. A country that you have, which really originally was an Italian colony. I mean, Berlin Conference, the powers to be in Europe met. Oh, they said, well, Italy doesn't have a colony. We're going to give Libya to Italy. It's okay, and Ethiopia. And then you move on to Egypt, a different ballgame altogether, because the army has been there ever since Jamal Abdel Nasser. I mean, Sadat was in the army, Mubarak was in the army. And you have a kind of junta, and I think the army will still rule. I mean, it's the biggest employer. 2 million people are employed by the army in Egypt. Okay, I don't think, I'm a little pessimist about Egypt. I don't think there will be a change. Even though the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, it goes back early in the 20th century, 1913, Al-Banna, very organized. I mean, this is a very organized establishment. And if there is a vacuum, I mean, if the military is not there, the army is not there, obviously they are going to fill in there. And if we had an election in Egypt today, I'm sure they'll be on top, and they will win the elections. So there is a kind of, even though during the revolution, these religious movements, they were not there. I mean, this is the revolution, dégage. I mean, as a matter of fact, even language-wise, you didn't even see any words in Arabic. Everything was conducted in French, which is, and it's done by people, due respect, no misunderstanding, your age, I mean, 19, 20, 21, 18. It's from that perspective, it's fascinating. What I found interesting in the West, I was in France at the time, I mean, you can see the intelligentsia or even the government, they were not interested in debating this matter, which is really an earthquake. They were simply annoyed and possibly even scared of a mass migratory movement, coming from these countries. And oh, what about Islamism? What about jihadism? What about, what is going to happen to us? So on the one hand, yes, we want democracy in the Arab world, but when it is on the threshold, well, these people are not capable yet, because let us look out after ourselves and see what happens in the future.
Could you say a bit more about how you, just make a little bit more explicit, your assumptions about what revolt entails? And because I assume it seems that that's short of, I guess the term would be revolution for you. So is it for you ideology free or allergic, or is it is it a first step in that process, or is this does this represent something different? I mean, is there sort of a historical law that you're reading into this? Say a little bit more about that, and what would revolution then require? Would it require meeting a certain standard for an ideological construction over against some other like construction? Can you speak
Yeah, it's
to
an
that?
Excellent point.
And how the regimes, it seems to me that among the regimes then that would provoke something like a revolution, what are the various types that we're talking about in this situation?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how are they constituted?
Mm-hmm.
How are they
Mm-hmm.
put together? And I think we'd be especially interested in the ideological regimes, and because it seems to me that that may be one way we could build a bridge, in the sense that the religious hierarchy, understood as a kind of regime, is held together in certain ways. So maybe help us to sort through some of that.
It's a very good point, in the sense that the concept of revolution tends to be, until very recently, I dare say, a purely Western and even European concept. Just like concept of universalism. You know, if you're published in Paris and London, then you become someone. But if you're published in Malawi and Chad, you're nobody. Mainly because there doesn't seem to be, or at least we think in the West, that there isn't a tradition. You know, we don't have a Shakespeare and a Beethoven, you know, and a Virginia Woolf in Malawi. Okay, Mr. Bernard Lewis has an interesting essay, you know, in which he argues that the Arabs are incapable of listening to classical music because they don't understand it. Okay, it's interesting. Okay, but the concept of revolution in itself is interesting, because when Louis XV was beheaded, I mean, you had this phrase, you know, "Vive le roi est mort," you know, I mean, it says, "Long live the king is dead." And even Cromwell, if you go back a little earlier, I mean, was a fascist. I mean, this is a man who lived better than any English king in none such palace. The edict that was signed, you know, in Parliament was not signed by Parliament, it was signed by Cromwell to have Charlie beheaded, you know, and move on. And I mean, he was very good for the United Kingdom, i.e. Wales, Scotland and England, but he was the worst ruler you can have for the Irish, you know, and even for the colonies at the time. So the idea of revolt and revolution, I think, unless you think of the Iranian Revolution, which took place, I mean, the Iranian Revolution, even language-wise, everything came from Iran itself, from the past, glorious past of that nation. I mean, when Khomeini died, I'm not glorifying Khomeini, when Khomeini died, they found a book of poetry, medieval poetry, a pair of glasses, and he slept on the floor. No television, no fridge, no nothing. It's a kind of Gandhi view of the revolution. Okay. Now, as you know, the dynamic between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, you know, that's Shia Islam, i.e., that's not authentic Islam. Okay, mainly because of Imam Hussein, you know, and how he was killed, and Aisha, you know, who is thought by Shia Islam as a prostitute because she's too young for the Prophet, who was 61. She was about 14 years old, and that's a long story. But I think what's happening in the Arab world today, there is a debate taking place. Is this a revolution, or is this an uprising, simple uprising? Is it a revolt? Is it... I think my own take on this is... My own take is that we are really operating outside of the confines of the West, Europe in particular. Okay, I think we are living in a different era altogether. I mean, mainly because of communication, technology, and so on and so forth. The concept of rising for one's dignity, perhaps a ruler does not to be killed. I mean, as long as he or she runs away. And I mean, look what Gaddafi is doing. But at the same time, I would argue that it is very difficult to adapt that concept within an Arab context, simply because the Arab world is a tribal world. Okay? I mean, I see this with my own eyes every day. Let's say I'm elected to a position of power, and you are the best in your area of expertise. I fire you. You have to go. I have to bring him, my cousin. I mean, he's my cousin. Wait a minute, my nephew. He doesn't know anything about the field you are in. But I have, you know, it's a sort of allegiance. It's blood is thicker than water, isn't it? From that perspective, I have a kind of negative capability, you know, vis-a-vis the concept. Whether this will materialize indeed in some sort of, some sort of a revolution, i.e., we are going to have some sort of a democracy, which was not Plato's favorite, by the way. I mean, oligarchy was. It's interesting because and even the countries that have adopted this concept for the last 200-300 years and even longer are struggling with it. I mean, the corruption you find in France today is absolutely phenomenal. Okay? I'm not qualified to speak about the United States because, I mean, you know, this is a very complex country.
There's no corruption.
You know. So it really is, what is going to happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years, and what role the United States in particular is going to play, because take Tunisia as a case in point. If it wasn't for the US, I mean, the American ambassador who kept, you know, sending messages about the ruling family and how they are literally, I mean, savaging the country, and which was discovered later on by WikiLeaks, okay, what would have happened? I mean, the French were closing their eyes because there is this sense of Latin view of the world, you know. The Italians were closing their eyes. The British following the French to a certain degree, the Spaniards. But it was the US ambassador who would send emails back to America saying, well, Ben Ali and his followers are really, I mean, hijacking the wealth of this country. I mean, the way they are ruling it is a sadist way. So the concept of revolt and revolution, it seems to me, is itself, that very concept is assuming a different definition altogether, because I mean, if you take Greece today as a case in point, I mean, is that a revolt? Is it an uprising? Is it a revolution? Unless we hang Gaddafi in a public place, is that or isn't that a revolution? Because the concept of revolution, at least viewed from a French point of view, and even English, one has to have an anointed king, you see, and spill the blood of that king, and then take over. The usurper assumes a much more interesting, at least from my point of view, a Marxist point of view, you know, a much more interesting role, okay? But again, you have terror and violence. I mean, every revolution is followed by some sort of violence and counter-violence. But within the Arab world, I have, as I said, I'm at cross purposes with the concept, because, let's face it, it is a tribal world. And unless we rise above that, I think the concept itself and the event in the Alam Badu sense of the word, I mean, this is massive. I mean, this is absolutely, this is that a tiny country such as Tunisia manages. I mean, look what's happening in Syria today, which is a different matter altogether, because in Syria you have a Shia minority, you know, Assad and co, about 15% ruling a Sunni majority, about 85%. What happened, it was the opposite in Iraq. In Iraq you had a Sunni minority, about 15-20%, ruling 80% Shia. Look what's happening in Bahrain, for example. You have 80% Shia, and then you have 20% Sunni, and Saudi Arabia has no intention whatsoever. As a matter of fact, they sent everything, money and everything, you know, to quell, you know, the uprising in Bahrain. So the concept itself has become much more fluid, okay, and I think within that context, i.e. the Arab Islamic context, because let us not kid ourselves, we have to be alert to the religious component. And when I say religious, here is really some sort of fanaticism, you know, a kind of, I mean, the concept of Islamism and jihadism and Islamofascism, I mean, that's a terrible phrase. I mean, Hitler was quite intelligent and incredible machine. You know, you can't have fascism in the Arab world. People, you know, 50% of them, you know, are illiterate. They have no bread, you know, to eat. And fascism was a much more elaborate concept in Europe. And Mr. Hitchens, you know, likes to throw that phrase, and Mr. Martin Ames and co. But that's a wrong concept. But I think Islamism, i.e. falling back on, because that's the only thing Arabs have today. If this happened, this is an important point for me. If this revolution happened in the 1960s, there was a left, a very strong left, you know, secular, you know. But today, this Leviathan called Europe, thinking mainly of Europe and Africa, and the United States of Europe, one country, and then we have Tunisia, a tiny country, and Malawi, and the peasant, in Malawi who's producing cotton. Where is he going to sell his cotton? Is he going to sell it, to France or Italy or Europe? So it really is a very the idea of Islamism, the idea of religiosity is quite scary, because at the end of the day, that's the common denominator that will unite everybody, or at least the majority. Okay, let me give you a very simple example. In Tunisia, I saw this past summer, for the first time in the last 50 years, young men strolling on beaches, telling young girls that they cannot wear, a bikini. That's it's not decent. There's a certain morality that you have to adhere to. I had never seen that before.
In what country was that?
Tunisia. Okay. So, which is supposed to be the Sweden of the Arab world, So there is that. It's a kind of latent, it's dormant. Okay, and if that were to take over after this so-called revolution, we are going to replace one dictatorship by another, which will probably be worse, in my view. Yes.
Let's open it up. Who do we have? Is it Joe?
Your talk's very thought-provoking, and I wanted to ask you about this notion of the event and help us think through a little bit about your conclusion. If I understand the notion of the event, it's something that's not predictable. It's something that diverges from what you emphasize, historical repetition. And I was intrigued by your analogy with Latin America in Cochabamba, and the way in which there's a new organizational strategy that's being used without obvious leaders. In the case of Latin America, we've seen a lot of very significant political changes. I don't know about the question of revolution or not, but we've certainly seen indigenous peoples rise to power, and obviously in Bolivia, and in other ways in other countries. Presidents being thrown out of office, sometimes in the case of Argentina repeatedly. So a lot of very significant political change that has implications for globalization, et cetera, et cetera. And what I was struck by in your conclusion is there's no clear sense to you of what this holds for the future of these countries where these revolutions have occurred.
Yes.
Let me just finish the question.
Sorry.
And that could be just a way of saying that the event is something we can't see the future of, and not so much a statement that these different revolutions are all going to descend either into chaos, this sort of meaningless violence that you mentioned, or into some sort of return to either Islamic, governance, or some other new dictator like the army and so on and so forth. And I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more on what that blank that you left us with at the end of the talk means.
Yes, thank you. I think my concept of the event is borrowed from Alain Badiou, and I think, let me give you his view very shortly, and then mine later on. For Alain Badiou, there has to be a kind of tabula rasa. Okay, we have what precedes the revolution and then the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Alain Badiou is very much involved, on the left,
mm-hmm.
with the working class and immigrants and so on in France. What Foucault early on would call, the amateur intellectual. For him, for Alain Badiou, the intellectual has to be specific rather than amateur, in the sense that he or she has to espouse causes and speak truth to power and never preach. I mean, never preach, because there is power of the rich and there is power of the poor. I mean, it goes without saying. I think, for me personally, the concept of event as far as the revolution is concerned, let's call it revolution, in the Arab world, is nothing ever happened of that magnitude. I'm sorry, I mean, when you look at history, look at Tunisia. Okay, there was Hannibal, was supposed to be an interesting general. Okay, but after that, it's a spiral descent into a kind of Nietzschean inferno. I mean, you had the Romans, then the Vandals, then the Spaniards, then the Arabs, then the Turks stayed for a long time there, and so for me there is almost a sense of denegation. That concept by Hegel whatever preceded this event, which is really massive, i.e. people, young people claiming, I mean, we want to live in dignity. I mean, for heaven's sake, I mean, I just want to live as a human being. I don't want to be co-opted or muzzled, you know. Or, it's in that sense. And my take, unlike Badiou's, I think his take is a little bit pessimist. My take is optimist, because I happen to be, geopolitically, I happen to be from that part of the world. On one condition, though, on one condition, that the monolithic does not hijack that event. In other words, this is it, you know, it's my way or no way. And that is the religious way of looking at things. That's, with due respect, you know, that's why I began, you know, early on with the concept of origins as opposed to beginnings. I think if you have a kind of, what you have in Turkey today, let's say, I mean, the wife of the Prime Minister wears a veil, a kind of veil, okay? They have managed, against all odds, to compose between Islam and democracy. But I discuss matters with enlightened people. I mean, we're educated in Europe and over there. I discuss matters with them and they simply say, well, democracy cannot really go hand in hand with Islam. Because Islam is an active, practical religion. I mean, it's in a sense where you find this phrase, you know, in the West, particularly in the United States, Judeo-Christian tradition, which is a fault. I mean, that's a falsity. If there is a religion that is close to Judaism in terms of a practice, it is Islam and not Christianity. I mean, the wailing on the wall, circumcision, halal meat, you know, if you leave your wife for a month, you have to marry her again, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's you know, the writing from right to left, 6 letters in Arabic are borrowed from Hebrew, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is very important. So the event for me, I think, is a kind of, I'm sure, have you ever seen that movie, Shawshank Redemption? You know, when they're talking in the middle and he says, Morgan Freeman, hope, you know, he says hope, you know. He says, if hope is a dangerous word, my friend, don't you ever use that, he says. I think for me, I have a dimension of hope. You know, it's not a romanticized hope, because people die every day. In Syria, as I speak to you today, I mean, people are dying in Bahrain, in Libya. Libya, as a matter of fact, is to be reconstructed from scratch, okay? That's one thing. Second thing, very briefly, is I have to be honest with you, I don't know what is going to happen in the next 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, you know that song by the Eagles, Great Expectations. We're in California, aren't we? I mean, there are great expectations, but let's see, you know.
I know I have 2 minutes. I see Tungan, Slobodsky, and then we'll get to David. So should we start here? Michael?
Right. I would like to follow up on a recent question about ideology. And I want to put it into a historical context. When you look at the Arab world, it was first of all under the Turks, the Ottomans. When the Ottomans were destroyed in World War I, there emerged Arab nationalism. In a sense, that ideology was the one that was actually used in order to liberate the Arabs from the Turks. And I think one could see that during that period, nationalism dominated. In a way, it was the ideology, which is, to a great extent, actually, is secular ideology. And I think that as it went on, the military became an important component of it. Okay? Nasser, in a way, represented that. In Iraq, you got the military dictators, ending with Saddam Hussein. Okay? Libya, Gaddafi came to power through the military. And in a way, if you look at the cultural attitude towards the military in the Middle East, it is one where the military is admired. And so that nationalism was combined with military dictatorship. And that is what actually persisted for a while. Now, what happened to it? I think the Arab-Israeli conflict destroyed the belief in that nationalism. And as a result, that gave rise to Islam is the solution.
Yes.
Islam is the solution.
Replacing Arab
Right,
nation.
replacing nationalism. And in a way, what has happened now as a result of this uprising is that Islam is the solution. It's actually an interlude that has no solution really. It did not lead anywhere. And so you can see how, for example, in Egypt, there is a rejection of that, of Al-Qaeda, for example, or even in Libya to a great extent.
Yes.
So it seems to me that ideology is important, and what is happening, I think, with this movement is that they do not have any ideology.
Granted, thank you for alluding to that. Let me go back to the 7th century. The Prophet dies. He's been dead for 3 days. The body is still waiting to be buried. And squabbles are taking place. Who's going to take over? The 4 caliphates after the Prophet are killed, assassinated. The 4 caliphates are related to the Prophet by blood. I mean, he marries.
Not all of them.
No, I mean, Ali.
Abu Bakr was not related.
No, a father-in-law.
But not
A father-in-law? No, well, a father-in-law. Excuse me, if I marry your daughter, with due respect, I mean,
Okay.
a father-in-law.
Okay.
This is very interesting, and this is what Fatima Marrouchi, a Moroccan scholar, calls the violence of the letter in her book, the Prophet and Women. This is, ideologically speaking, this is very interesting. Whereas the Prophet, you could argue, according to Armstrong, famous British, and even Hisham Jayed, these people have written a biography of the Prophet, an interesting man in his time. But ideologically speaking, we are going to have some sort of a maghazm because of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, who takes power and installs it in Damascus with his son Zayd, who kills Imam Hussein and so on. So the idea of ideology in Islam, whether under Nasser or not, okay, I'm jumping a little bit historically speaking, is really fraught with some very difficult issues to deal with, simply because we are dealing with violence. I mean, I'm not saying, don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying Islam is a violent religion, as you hear, in the media and so on. That's not my point. My point is the practice of Islam itself. I mean, Nasser and the entire Arab world in the 60s, they were blinded by their own insight. I mean, Bourguiba goes to a conference 1967 in Cairo and says, listen, after the war, you have to compose with Israel. It's another narrative that is taking place here. And the Palestinians can take their state. It's a different narrative altogether. And let's move on. And he was expelled. He was expelled. He was put in a plane and sent back to Tunis. So the idea of ideology in Islam, when you dance the flamenco, it's an interesting, shady dance. It suits most Muslims to claim a certain ideology, but it suits them also to reject that ideology altogether and sit back on some kind of Islam. Because in here, it's not Islam really, it is Islams. I mean, I visited Pakistan, and you go to Indonesia and Saudi Arabia, which happens, okay, because I've never been there, but I have friends. This is a sheer racist society, Saudi Arabia. With Kuwait, it's one of the most racist society on earth. And yet they preach this sort of, the trouble today taking place in the Arab world comes from Saudi Arabia, pure and simple. I observed this time and again because of the money. We send our petrol, to the United States, we get the dollars. The Salafists and the Wahhabists, to go back to Ibn Tumaymah, 13th century, a blinded view of Islam, as opposed to Ibn al-Arabi, 11th century thinker from Andalusia, okay? And the Salafists today, they have an incredible hold simply because money. And with due respect, I hope you agree with me, money has, is a commodity that has no smell, ideologically speaking. Either you have it or you don't have it. And to me, I think that is the detriment of Islam today, because if Saudi Arabia were to, something has to happen, and only the people can answer back to Saudi Arabia democratically.
So let's try this as we are running out of time. If you could put your questions or comments out there, as succinct as possible, and then...
I'm sorry I'm long, it's terrible life,
So, Santiago, and then we'll go.
I will be as quick as I can. It's going to be not a theoretical question. I really appreciate what you are doing, trying to go beyond a Marxist-Leninist understanding of revolution, passing to, I would say, postmodern post-Marxist understanding Hardt Negri. But there is something that both Marxist-Leninists and Hardt Negri agree, which is the power of the capital in actually creating situations and actually sometimes even encouraging revolutions. And even though Marxist-Leninist perspective is going to see that the capital nation state is pushing forward the revolution, and Hardt Negri is going to leave it in some kind of amorphous empire, both of them do believe that there's a power of capital trying to manage situations within the revolution. And in your account, it doesn't seem, in your idea of spontaneity of people with no ideology, doesn't seem to be any influence of the capital in the laws that were happening. Especially taking into account, I finish with this, that actually the US strongly supported both Tunisia and Egypt. So my question will be, in your theoretical framework, where there is a clear spontaneity of people embracing without more than protest and indignation, where is the power of the capital managing situations?
The only
So let's just, I know you, let me just restrain you just for a moment.
Thank you.
So the
Thank you.
power of capital, all right.
Yes.
And ism, yes. Now, David and Jonas.
Thank you, Professor, for this very brilliant and passionate presentation.
Thank you.
Touching my nerves. And I was wondering if I might ask you, I think, going a similar route, what's the role of the center of the world? The West might be in orchestrating these so-called revolutions. Is the West trying to orchestrate like the Wizard of Oz, you know, like hiding behind the curtain and saying, this is how to do it? Is the West trying to, in a way, give the Arab world a text for how to live in a democracy? Because you made mention of the absence of constitution. So is that a problem? Or what exactly is happening here? What is the drama?
All right, so power of center, West, Wizard of Oz, okay, all right. Jonas?
Thank you, Professor Marrouchi. That was quite provocative. And it gave me something to think about. It is very important and has been very important to East Africa, where I am from, because of the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
Libya, for better or for worse, Libya, through Gaddafi, has been a dominant force in Africa for a long time, for as long as Gaddafi has been there. And he perfected the practice of the ideology or culture of divide and rule, you know, among the African leaders. And we saw the African Union being tested to its core, and its validity really not proving to be of any substance during the conflict. Now, you presented this survey of events which have been going on in the Middle, in North Africa especially. You called it the Arab Spring, with a rather optimistic view all through. Towards the end, I detected not a pessimistic, but a cautionary note. You ended by saying, these people have embraced the culture or the ideology of revolt without a revolution. Now, in your opinion, and you termed that to be an inherent weakness. Now, in your opinion, do you think that by them not allowing the West, and especially I'm thinking of Libya, that's what you had in mind as you were closing, you think that by them not having other people, especially the West, on the ground, in terms of boats and personnel, is going to derail, you know, whatever they have achieved?
Thank you all. It's first question. I go back to Paul Valéry, and by the way, I'm not a Marxist, because when I read what Marx says about me coming from Africa or India, there's an interesting book that came out of Chicago, Karl Marx at the Margins, a book that is really, I mean, tearing the world into pieces, by a man called Anderson. So when I read what Karl Marx says, he visits Algeria in 1834, and he says, you know, l'entreprise française, he says. So I really cannot be, or even Freud for that matter, what Freud says about Africa, you know, that the African, quote unquote, is not capable of representing himself or herself. They have a child, the mind of a child, and they need the supervision of the white man, quote unquote. So I really cannot be a Marxist or Leninist for that matter, because it's not. I'm a kind of hybrid, terrible thing. You know, I look at life and my life in the world, But you are right. I go back to Paul Valéry. The only capital I think of, as far as these revolutions are concerned, is the cultural capital, i.e. the people themselves. Because these young people, they really gave us a lesson. I think gave us a lesson to the entire world. And you know what? No one, including some of the most highly intelligent people in the world, anticipated or foresaw what was going to happen. And when you speak to these people, and I did, I mean, when you speak to 18, 20-year-olds, they are way, way, way ahead. I mean, they have a connection with you and with you and with you worldwide. They don't have a connection with me. In other words, the connection is more horizontal. They're going to send you, you know, a picture of the army beating someone in Tunis, okay, somewhere in Australia or in California. But they don't have a connection with me, vertically speaking, because I happen to be older. Oh, no, this is not your fight. This is not your battle. This is ours. So that is, to me, the reason why I mentioned Negri and Hart. I think what Negri, especially in Empire and Commonwealth, what they do is that they do connect this youth worldwide, so to speak. Because you have a Leviathan, you know, you have Davos here, and we have the rest of us here. You have the club of the West, you know, they dine and wine, God knows. And then we have the rest of us who cannot even buy a pair of shoes. It's in that sense, to me, that the only capital, I think, and I hope, is an educated, young, committed generation of people who are bent on changing things. And it's in that sense, it could be Marxist. I mean, it's 180 degrees in that sense.
Can I interject, because you just talked about Saudi Arabian capital.
I mean, it's just phenomenal. Believe me. I mean, I've done my homework, especially in Egypt. I slept for 3 months in the city of the dead outside of Cairo, where you have about 6 million people who sleep there every night. This is a cemetery, okay? And I saw with my own eyes in the middle of the night, people coming with cash, US dollars. You want to get married? How much money do you need? Here you go. When am I to pay? You don't pay. But when we call on you, you have to be ready to kill and maim, and that's what Saudi Arabia is doing today. I mean, the Wahhabi, when you have the Salafists, I'm digressing a little bit, to me it doesn't make sense at all. I read yesterday in Le Monde Diplomatique that the Saudis are going to allow their women, quote unquote, to vote in municipal election in 2015. Wow, you know, what a leap. So it's anyway. As to the second, second. I'm sorry, my memory is going to the dogs. Remind me again.
The center or the west.
Oh, I mean,
center. Actually, both. I think.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, the center. Mudimbi wrote a beautiful book, The Invention of Africa. What will be Europe without Africa? You know, for the self to valorize itself, there has to be a barbarian on the other side. You know, there's a beautiful poem by C.P. Cavafy, Waiting for the Barbarians. He was gay, you know, and he lived in Egypt, you know, and aesthetically gay, in Alexandria all his life. And the poem ends, you know, what are we going to do, you know? I mean, these barbarians were a kind of solution, you know? So it's self-serving, I mean, for the West. But you see, the West keeps playing, you know, a kind of double role. Oh, it's great, these people are liberating themselves. But at the same time, are they capable enough, you know? It's a kind of, well, they are sprinters, you know, 100 meters and that's it. You know, they will run out of steam. Or are we going to have a marathon and these people will eventually liberate themselves and be like us? It's the degree, allow me please, I mean, degree of hypocrisy and denegation and politics of denial. And I mean, I was in France, especially, I must say, in Europe. I mean, it's just phenomenal, or the United Kingdom or Germany. The only worry was, how are we going to deal with these hordes of immigrants, you know, coming on our doorstep, you know? And then
the anxiety about, you know, the weakness of this revolution, of this movement, revolt without revolution.
Yes, I mean, to me, you know, I'm a Father Christmas, you know, I'll pack it in, you know, in the next few years. I'm deep down, because I have nephews and nieces who participated in this. One of them was imprisoned, you know, thank God he was not dead. I think to me there is a gleam of hope in the sense that, as I said, this generation who's leading the revolution today in the Arab world is highly intelligent and highly educated. I don't know how to tweet, you know. I mean, but my niece does. She's 14 years old. I'm serious. And within seconds she's communicating with someone in Cairo or Alexandria or Manama, you know, and she says to me, you know, look, I got this message from Manama, and they're doing very well, you know, they're not giving up. And we're encouraging them. So in here, there is a redemption coming from the West, i.e. technology, even though it's forcibly fed, you know.
We're out of time. Join me in thanking